All right, welcome to our day on global and large-scale groundwater hydrology. Our first speaker today is Professor Ying, who's at Rutgers University in New Jersey in the US. She's a professor in Earth and Planetary Science and Department of Biological Sciences. And she will be giving our first presentation. Take it away.
All right. It's day 4 of week 2, so I promise no equations. I'm going to really. It's not much of a lecture, but more of an invitation for everyone to, continue to focus on the scale you're working on. But once in a while, step out and then look at the big picture and ask yourself, how does what we learn at the scale, the pore, the reservoir, the hill slope, the core scale, whatever scale you're working on, how can that inform our large-scale understanding? So that's basically the theme. And so the idea is that the global, we have to look at global processes. We are in a period of rapid global change. And the lithosphere is a big part of the Earth system that regulates, modulates global change through many, many pathways. And we have to care, and we have to contribute because we're the only community who can actually come up with a vision of how to describe the lithosphere, the fluids in the upper lithosphere, and what functions that play in the whole Earth system. Okay, so that's the theme. So I'm going to have 4 sort of parts. First, just a little bit of asking ourselves why. Why do we need to zoom out to this global scale, looking at Earth, from space, basically, and we lose all the granularity, we lose the critical skills where processes happen. But why do we need to do that still? Okay, so that's the first question. We're going to walk through very quickly some simple ideas. And the second thing we want to talk about is how do we kind of help? That is to ask ourselves, what does the upper lithosphere do to the climate system, to the long-term carbon cycle, to the biosphere? And so we're going to very quickly some obvious functions walk through. And then after this, then we can outline the questions that we as a community can actually provide answers to the global modeling community. And then we can talk about going forward, what we can do, what is the responsibility of this community. Think about the lithosphere, it's just a giant porous media. And we've got the biggest porous media problem of the world, we own it. Good, for worse, for bad. It's our problem. So we need to engage. We need to contribute. But again, this global vision cannot be sort of detached from our site-based, lab-based core, pore to core to hill slope to small scales we're working on that where we can actually make measurements and conduct experiments and understand what drives what. Okay, so we cannot create a global vision without roots, deep roots in the process level understanding. So we need both ends of the spectrum. But we need to kind of go back and forth. It's like playing on Google Earth. Who likes to Google Earth? I spend countless hours just roaming because you can fly, you can zoom in, zoom out, zoom in, zoom out. It's very satisfying. It's a pleasure. So I'm going to invite you to sort of envision a Google Earth underground. So you can not only zoom in, but dive down and swim like, Jules Verne's, novel. We can go underground and swim around and then encounter different rock layers, different sedimentary layers, different fossils, all the stuff, all the wonderful stuff that's unseen, unknown in the subsurface. And we have the capacity to do so in today's technology and with all this data Okay, so that's the outline of the talk today. Okay, so first, why Earth system scale? And it really, I think, probably the question that's on everybody's mind today is this: where's our planet heading, right? It keeps us awake, at night, because we have news almost every day, every week. The fire season getting longer. The fire burns more extensively in places that have never seen fire before. Our hurricanes are getting more extensive. Our heat waves are, becoming more and more frequent and severe. And in my lifetime, I'm 64. In my lifetime, I see a huge change. As a child, I could skate on ponds that freeze every winter. No more. Not even close. The ice doesn't even form anymore. So it's the rate of change is so rapid, so mind-boggling, and so that is really the scary part. So many probably, I would think most of us are really frightened by where we're heading, right? And so where is the planet heading? How do we know? We can't put the Earth in a laboratory to do experiment to it. It's too big, right? So what can we do? What is the laboratory we have? The global Earth system models. Okay, so that's the only crystal ball we have, really. We understand. We think we understand the physics. Basic physics, chemistry, biology, how that works. We have the first principles. So we can trust the first principles and trust our mathematical skills to apply the same principles and project into the future. Give us some glimpse in there's problems. Every domain of the Earth system model has their own problems. Okay, so but what is the Earth system model? Basically, that's the IPCC models. They call them Earth system models. Some people call them IPCC models. They are really powerful suite of tools for us to do experiments, to double CO2, triple CO2, whatever, different emission scenarios. That's the only laboratory we have. We call it a numerical laboratory. Unfortunately, that's the only way we can project into the future based on our understanding of basic physics, chemistry, biology. So these Earth system models basically have 4 large domains: the atmosphere, where you see the ocean, follow the river down. But we're very close to the ocean. The sea is a little, not ocean, but it's connected to the ocean. And ice, the cryosphere, ice sheets, and the lithosphere. Okay, so these are the 4 large physical domains, and nested and going through and lived, or these 4 domains provide the physical sort of habitat for life. So there's the biosphere. Biosphere is permeating through the entire Earth system. Okay, so these are the 4 domains, and Earth system models have been in development for 50, 60 years, so decades, starting from the numerical weather prediction models, getting more and more sophisticated. Now these models have carbon cycle, dynamic vegetation, and has nitrogen cycle, phosphorus cycle. There's so many more processes being built in now. Okay, so the model has become very sophisticated, and here is a sort of a simulation of atmosphere vapor transport. And you see the white is vapor rising from the land, from the ocean. And the orange is where the vapor the air mass has risen high enough to condense, to chill, to condense, and to rain. So this is 3-dimensional. We're looking at 2D, 3-dimensional. So how deep does the atmospheric model go? 80 kilometers is the minimum. Most atmospheric models go much, much deeper. Why? It's not arbitrary number. It's based on our understanding of the atmospheric dynamics, the whole profile, right? We have our boundary layer, the friction with the land surface. We have our troposphere, where all the weather happens. When you get on the plane, you go to cruising altitude, and that is stratosphere because it's above the weather. There's no turbulence, smoother flight. But troposphere is very important because of the ozone and aerosols. They regulate the radiation balance. Okay, so we include that for a good reason. And we also include the mesosphere because of these nocturnal ice clouds that form over the polar regions. And that is very important in regulating the warming and the cooling of a polar region. So every depth, every layer included. So most models go to 80 kilometers. 80 kilometers, which will show how shallow our land model goes. You will see this huge contrast of shallowness. But what is the depth and what processes have to be included in those models are informed by our understanding, three-dimensional understanding of dynamics. Because each domain has its own internal dynamics, time scales, everybody is pulsing in their own rates, but they also exchange with each other, so they influence each other. There's this feedback, and the fast ones speed up the slow ones slow down the fast ones. So there's dynamics because of the interactions. So the atmosphere is a fast-changing environment, but how deep we should go is informed by processes. We also have, on the ocean side, it's not supposed to have sound. Can we turn off the sound? I guess it's okay. We can just keep going. It's good to have a little bit of music. So can we turn off the sound?
Oh, I don't know.
Okay. On my computer, it's okay. Okay. So the idea is you see these ocean currents. These are called the boundary currents. That goes on the boundaries of continents. So this is one current going, that's a stream, Gulf Stream that keeps Europe warm, Rossby waves. And you have these three-dimensional ocean, again informed by ocean circulation. This is the exchange zone, the mixing zone. Right? We've been talking about mixing of atmosphere and ocean. And so you have a temperature that's homogenized and then decreases. And we have to include the whole depth of ocean to get those conveyor belts right. You know, the warm Gulf Stream, the western current, and then the deep water boundary current. That's the cold that comes back, because that is really, this is important for land, for sea and air exchange, and this is critical for long-term energy balance of the world, because the heat is transported from the equator to the polar region and it sinks down. Okay, so the ocean science community had developed this 3D understanding of the dynamics of the ocean, boundary layer, and then deep convection belts. And here's the ice. Again, it's a three-dimensional ice model. You know, this is speed up because we know glaciers move very slowly. This is water and ice movement. And so based on the understanding of the entire ice sheet dynamics. So we have all these fantastic images of the other domains, the atmosphere, the ocean, and the ice. But what about lithosphere? Have you seen anything so inspiring? The light is on. It's very, can we turn off the light? Because it's glaring and it washes off the, maybe the sound is triggering. Thank you. Yeah, so lithosphere, have you seen anything inspiring and fantastic like the ocean, the atmosphere? Quiet. Right, we don't. We have lots of knowledge. We have incredible amount of deep, sophisticated understanding at the pore scale, at the core scale, at the macro pore, the column scale, side scale, at the hill slope scale. You have fractures, you have macropores at hill slope, the fracture flow, the different kind of quick flow versus the diffusive flow, and we have all these incredible data. And site data and theories and models, right? That's what we have been doing. And I was trained as a classic, hydrogeologist. And at your age, I was thinking about Rayleigh number. How does the turnover of saline and the fresh water and the stability of stratified fluids? I was thinking about swimming equations, like most of you do. But as I aged, I kind of, sort of got detached a little bit and stepped out. So this is what we do, and this is fundamentally important because that's how we know what's driving what happens. We have this, but we don't really have a picture of how water moves on the continent because we haven't really invested in producing that big picture vision, necessarily coarser because you lose the granularities. take off. You don't see the land anymore. Who would like to sit in the window seat in an airplane? Nobody. I always do. Yes, I always do the window seat because it's fantastic to see the land from 30,000 cruising altitude. It's different perspective. You lose granularity, but you gain a different perspective, different picture, different patterns. So by necessity, it has to be hierarchical. But we don't really have that. In the ocean, in the atmosphere, the cloud microphysics, cloud microphysics is very complicated. It's the particle molecule level. In the ocean, my husband studied plankton, so it's tiny, tiny little creatures, but they add up to the global carbon and geochemical cycle. And so it's like we have the same idea. We have those granularity, the complexity, but we also should come up with a pattern of global simplicity. Okay, so that's the idea. Here, we don't have a global picture, so we don't really have a view of a mental image, what happens at the continental scale and global scale. The closest I have is this. David Maidman, a hydrologist in the US, sent me this image. And when the national water model for the US was just being born, and he sent me this, hey, we can do it. We can do the continental hydrology. No problem. It's beautiful. But I said, David, it's only rain falling on the land. They're like marbles. They don't infiltrate. They just roll down the hill. So that's why you see things moving so fast. In hours, the river have reached the sea. They didn't even have the porous media below at all. He said, well, it's just a proof of concept. We can do this. And so I said, it doesn't count because you don't have the porous media. We know rivers don't flow because of rain. Rivers can flow for weeks, months, days without rain. It's groundwater. Majority of the river water comes from groundwater. So the temporal dynamics is completely off. It's fascinating. It's cool to look at, but it's a proof of concept, he said. I totally agree with him. And so their point is that despite we know so much at the small scales, we don't have a compelling large-scale mental picture of the subsurface. We cannot tell the Earth system modeling community, hey, you need to do this, you need to do this. We have been not engaging at all. Very, very few people engage, and our voices are not heard at all. Okay, so despite this, we don't have a large-scale picture. And because of this, there is a perceived shallowness by climate scientists, aka the Earth system model developers. And they think land is very shallow. Lithosphere is very shallow because the model it basically takes this form. The land is about 2 to 3 meters thick and very wide, hundreds of kilometers, big slabs. Mountains a little higher, big slabs. And so they don't have the variability inside. And so they have plant roots are sort of 1 meter deep for herbaceous plants, 2 meter deep for woody plants. It's very simple. This is early incarnation of the land models. And so this thin soil can hold some water so that when rain doesn't happen, you can still evaporate and transpire. You can still provide some moisture to the atmosphere. And whatever the soil cannot hold in that shallow soil is put in the river, mysteriously in the river. How does it get into the river? It doesn't care. It's just put in the river and quickly routed out, by just putting a little delay and put it in the ocean. Okay, so there's this perceived shallowness, and this is not written by hydrologists, by the way. This is written by climate scientists. That's how they see land hydrology. Oh, it's shallow. It's really a boundary condition for the atmosphere. They don't really care what's below. And we know the land is not just a boundary condition, right? We all live on land. And it's a center of change, global change. We are the greatest agents of change. We live on land. We change the climate system through land by pulling out fossil fuels, by destroying habitats. We are the people. So it's no longer a boundary condition, but early on, it's only a boundary condition. So Suki Manabe, by the way, won the Nobel Prize. He was the first person to put in a land model we call it a leaky bucket model. So the rain comes in, it's a bucket, it leaks, and that's it. So what happens below? They don't care, they don't know. And I had next door a colleague who is a climate modeler. And I said, show me how the land model is done. And he showed me the picture. And I said, but where's the groundwater? And he said, what's groundwater? So that tells you the disconnect. So we are not really educating them. And so a lot of the hydrologists in the global climate modelers are educated by the model. That's all they know. The model is their learning tool. So they don't take hydrology class. Meteorology departments, some departments require hydrology. In my school, hydrology is required course. They are just really opening their mind. Oh, there's so much going on below the ground. So our education system, our science education system, we don't have Earth system level education, but they compartmentalized, geology department, atmospheric science department, and it's the lithosphere is the interface that makes everything so much more fun, so much more interactive and dynamic and delightful in a way. Okay, so because of this perceived shallowness, the models often give you very sort of drastic results. Amazon forest will die because they don't have the water storage. So processes are wrong, and it's really have lots of consequences. So if it does not make sense to you, we have to help. That's really my message. If this doesn't make sense to you, who thinks this makes good sense? Who thinks that it doesn't make sense at all? Right? Yes. If it bothers you, I think we need to do something. We can't just say, that doesn't make sense, and walk away. It's really our responsibility. Okay, so basically, the Earth system land model, building this whole enterprise, there's so many people that are building land models. I see that as a porous media problem because much of hydrology is below ground. It's I always tell my students that 90% of hydrology is groundwater is hydrogeology. And 90% of hydrogeology is geology. Knowing the structure of the porous media is critically important. That's the fabric where water flows through. Okay, so we have a big porous media problem. We own it, as I said before. Okay, so where do we start? How do we really contribute to the Earth system modeling community? I think we need to really walk through some obvious Earth system functions, the hydrogeology in the upper lithosphere. What does it do to the global climate system, the biosphere and the atmosphere, ocean circulation, for example? So we walk through some of those questions. Okay, and then we can ask specifically, how can we contribute? Okay, so let's walk through some Earth system functions. Give me some good examples of why, what does it do? What does the hydrogeology do to the climate? Can anyone give me a yes?
Buffers drought.
Buffers drought. So the lithosphere is the base for land ecosystems, plants, animals, soil microbes. You and I, we all depend on that shallow part, the soil, the productive part. And so the water storage in that shallow, I shouldn't say shallow, the upper lithosphere, maybe top 1 kilometer or so, is critical for basically entire terrestrial life. And when the buffers drought, what does it do? It keeps the plants to transpire, and that supplies the moisture to the atmosphere. When you have more transpiration to the atmosphere, what do you do to the atmosphere? You actually lower the boundary, the planetary boundary, the turbulent boundary. Cooler, lower. You change the profile of dynamics and thermodynamics. So the land is actually a boundary condition to the atmosphere. That is the good reason why, that's the reason why the early climate models included land, because the fluxes from the land, the latent heat versus sensible heat, plays a fundamental role in determining that boundary layer height, and the cloud condensation level, and a whole suite of dynamics, thermodynamics in the atmosphere. So as boundary condition to the atmosphere as the base for terrestrial ecosystems, base for humanity. That's all our water, right? Fresh water, even we use river water, comes from groundwater. And groundwater is the largest freshwater reservoir. And not just for water consumption, but it's the food production, energy production. It's the energy, food, water, food, and energy nexus. That's all depending on the groundwater storage. Another good reason, how does the lithosphere affect the ocean? Who knows, have heard about chemical weathering? We all did, good. So what that is basically rain falling from the atmosphere become acidic by dissolving CO2 in the atmosphere and hits the land. It becomes even more acidic if there's a biosphere, because what plants do is to pull CO2 from the atmosphere, inject into the soils. And so because the roots respire and put that CO2 into the soil. So, and the roots also is the base of the soil food web. And so microbes, bacteria, and fungus, and you name it, they all, and burrowing animals, they all respire. So they make that soil liquid even more CO2 rich. And they also secrete organic acid. So the rain is already acidic, slightly acidic, going through the atmosphere, going into soil that teeming with life, and becomes even more acidic, and then it hits the bedrock. What happens then? You have the acidic base and acid-base reaction. You dissolve the minerals. When you dissolve the minerals, especially silicate minerals, you break down the minerals into calcium, magnesium, and bicarb, and that gets flushed into the ocean. And then what do you do in the ocean? The planktons need those ingredients to make shells. And when they die, they sink to the bottom. They form carbonate rocks. So this is the long-term geological carbon cycle. All depends on the land supply of major ions by dissolving the rocks. Okay, so here are some of the four sort of obvious Earth system level functions of the land hydrology. Base for humanity, habitat for land ecosystem, lower boundary condition for the atmosphere, and the lateral flux boundary condition for the ocean downslope. And so I also didn't mention that here's the chemical weathering process that regulates the long-term carbon cycle at 7 million to above 7 million, 10 million years. Every 7 million years or so, this cycle is completed. So for long-term climate, I'm from the geology department, so I hang out with geologists. They said 7 million is too short. They don't care. They want to study 3.8 billion years ago when life originated. So, but this is big deal. This regulates our Earth climate system because this long-term carbon cycle, we call that the thermostat of the Earth. We have gone through all kinds of radiation orbital changes, but the Earth never ran away because of this geological carbon cycle. I don't have time to go into the details. I'm happy to talk to you why it's a thermostat for the Earth climate temperature regime. But the freshwater flux into the ocean is a critical component as well because it provides nutrients. And I think Audrey talked about all the fluxes of nutrients from the estuaries. She also talked about submarine estuaries. But the surface river estuaries is an example of, the ocean is actually a desert. It's nutrient poor. It depends on the land to wash out all the nutrients to sustain all the marine life. And all the fishes spawn in the freshwater in the estuary zones, right? So our food comes from there. And the freshwater flux to the ocean is also important because that regulates the thermohaline convection. You have fresh water going into the Arctic high latitude, and then that is a bad thing because that dilutes the water so it's not dense, it doesn't sink. And so if we melt all the glaciers and we have lots of fresh water in the northern latitudes, it's going to slow down that big heat conveyor belt, which is disastrous. And we know that when the glacier melted in the last 21,000 years, from now, 12,000 years ago, there is a reverse of the glacier melt. Ice started to grow, and because the younger dryas, exactly. That is caused by a huge meltwater from Laurentide ice sheet going into the ocean and making that deep water and not dense enough and not sinking. So reverse reverse warming and became cooling again. So the freshwater influx is also very important in regulating the ocean, not physically and geochemically, especially at long time scales. So these are some of the functions. Now with these functions in mind, we can ask, are the standard land models sufficient? In other words, are 2 to meter thick? Can 2 to meter thick land surface perform function? The answer is obvious. Everybody's shaking their head already. So then we need to ask how deep is sufficient. And then we need to understand what processes happen at what depth matter to what part of the Earth system, at what time scales. Okay, so these are the questions that our community must pose for ourselves and must provide answers. So that's our part 3. Okay, so number 1, some obvious questions. What is the porosity permeability structure of the upper lithosphere? When you close your eyes, what do you see? Is this an adequate description? You have soil, you have regolith, you have some interface, and you have fractures, and that's full of waters. Is that adequate? Is that adequate everywhere? And what is the depth of this interface, the transition? We know a lot at a lot of the sites. We do geophysics, we do boreholes, we have intuitive understanding of the sites, but zooming out at the continental scale, at the global scale, we really don't have a picture. Okay, so specifically, this is necessarily hierarchical because we have different structures at different scales. So we cannot dream of one product. We're dreaming of like a Google Earth. You know, if you look at Google Earth, I'll show that. Somewhere down there, there's a Google Earth image. If you go to Google Earth, you will see this little word down there that tells you what product, what satellite image is this. You zoom in, it's a different product. You zoom in, it's a different product. Until you go to the site, it's actually, you know, some actual photographs. And so this is the hierarchical structure is necessary, and it's actually nature's language. Nature always is always hierarchical. So we have to respect that to describe that. Because if we build a global scale digital crustal structure, it has to have all that multi-scale. We have data to do so. They're scattered everywhere. So can we put that together to do this? So specifically, we know we have to have multi-scales. And the question is, at each scale, what is the structure? What matters or not? For what reason? And at each scale, what are the predictable structures that we can describe, we have to describe deterministically versus noisy or stochastic structures that we can use statistical stochastic tools. We really have to, you know, force ourselves to go through this exercise to actually have a conceptual understanding of multi-scale variability. And so Google Earth Underground. It's a hierarchical product. There's no reason we can't do so. We'll see a lot of data gaps, but the large scale, we have geologic maps. And zooming into smaller scale, we're probably less and less data. And you just imagine you go down in there, you're swimming around, you hit a cross section. You know, somebody uploaded a cross section, and I saw Annalise poster. There's the ground penetrating radar cross section of Panola catchment of a hill slope. Why don't we put all our cross sections in there? And when you swim in there, you'll see, okay, this has been studied, this has been measured, so I don't have to do this again. So it's just so much more efficient if we can put all our data together. We know what we have, what we don't. Right? So there's so many advantages to do so. So that's our first set of questions. What is the structure, the bone of the lithosphere? And then we can pour water on it. Now we can ask hydrologic questions. How deep does the modern meteoric fluid plumb the lithosphere? It's a simple question. How deep does the rain reach? And so let's make it a little more specific. How deep does the rain infiltrate? It just rained last night. Anybody heard the thunderstorm? I couldn't sleep because I'm so nervous about this talk. So I just timed the thunderstorm, lightning, you know, crashing thunder, and then rain. And I had this urge to go out to see how deep does the rain penetrate into the soil. Where's the wetting from? But I don't have the tools. I found a spoon and went out to dig, but it was gravel. So it's artificial pavement, so I really couldn't get a sense. But at home, every time it rains, I go to my garden and I dig to see how much of the soil is wetted. Why is that important? Farmers can decide, do I need to water? It's very shallow wetting. You have to water it because the roots are deeper. And if it's deep penetrating, you don't have to worry about it. And that penetration depth is so important because that is the habitable depth. If you have seasonally deep penetrating rain, we'll have this thick zone. You will see roots will occupy that. Okay, so specifically, how deep does the rain infiltrate into the ground? It's a very simple, childish question almost. It rained. How deep does it wet, right? Second question, how deep are plant roots? Because in this figure, rain comes in and much of the rain is actually short-circuited, pumped up by plant roots. So how deep is the roots? What is this return zone? So that infiltration have to pass below it in order to survive being pumped back up. And that's also another basic question. What is the rooting depth? And then, how deep is the water table? Because the infiltration rooting depth also will be interfering with water table where water table is shallow. And so plant roots live between the water table and the land surface. And infiltration gives the shallow water, water table gives the deep water. How do they interact to determine plant roots? And etc. So these are some simple questions. If we think through this, how deep the rain penetrate, now we can tell the climate modelers, wait a minute, 2 to 3 meters only works in the swamps. Elsewhere, it doesn't work because the layer of land surface that supplies evapotranspiration is much, much deeper. But where is it deeper? Why is it deeper? And we have to figure that out. Okay, so that is the boundary condition to the atmosphere. We can figure out what is the depth that actually influences the atmosphere. And then as a boundary condition to the ocean, we can ask how deep, how much the rain reaching the water table for sure. You have to reach the water table before you can flush a thing into the ocean. And so this is basically a groundwater recharge question. And Christian will talk about that in later half this morning. So this is how much the rain actually survives the short circuit zone, reaches the water table, and then carrying that weathering product into the streams and eventually into the ocean. So that continuity, hydrologic continuity, is a huge unknown. We don't really know how much of that actually, what mechanism, where, and that occurs, that contributes minerals to the ocean. And how long does it stay in the groundwater system? That's a residence time. I think several people, and Audrey mentioned the down cooler number, which is really the equilibrium, chemical equilibrium time versus your residence time. It affects the kinetics of weathering product, chemical weathering. And so how deep does it circulate into the lithosphere? And we know that from towing flow, we're all familiar with that. Groundwater flow is multi-scale, it's nested, and it can be very deep. How deep does it go? That is the depth that supplies material to the ocean. So that we can tell the Earth system modelers, you need to go this depth if you want to simulate long-term carbon cycle. And sooner or later, I predict, ESM, the Earth system models, will include long-term biogeochemical cycle. And that's the long-term thermostat. Okay, and what is the depth in humans? We have been pulling stuff out, injecting stuff in at various depths and over a century or so now. How do we replumb the subsurface fluid? Okay, so these are the questions we need to ask. And imagine if we can have answers to these questions. And all the movies we could make, and I'd be very happy, and I'm sure you'll be very happy too. Just imagine if we could deliver that to the Earth system modeling community and give them a clear mental image of what's going on below the ground that you cannot see. Okay, so then this comes to our last part, and this will take longer because I'm just setting up some of the questions and the motivation. Why do we need to engage? And then we can ask, how are we going to do this? Okay, how do we proceed? Let's see how the atmospheric science community did this. How did they develop a three-dimensional dynamic vision of the atmosphere? They started from this boring, humble weather stations. And the weather stations are the dots. They started with the dots. And the dots, with time, it grew. Okay, so start with we have that. So the weather station started to grow, occupy more land surface, so they can have a two-dimensional view of the temperature, pressure, wind. And then they also started to have ship lanes to record the observations from the ships coming back to the harbor. Okay, so the next level, about 100 years ago, they started this radio song program, which is basically a balloon with an instrument attached to the bottom and with a little note. If you receive the instrument, please mail this back and you'll receive this much kind of reward. So I was just finishing a book called Waters of the World. And it's a great book. It's about the scientists who unraveled the mysteries of our oceans, atmospheres, and ice sheets and made the planet whole. It's talking about how they started from humble observations and constructed this 3D picture. And so in this book, it talked about Walker, Gilbert Walker. Who knows the Walker circulation in the atmosphere? I've heard of that. Hadley circulation, Walker circulation. And he was the director in the Indian subcontinent. It is so washed out, it's very hard to see. The Indian subcontinent is somewhere here. And he was the one sent out the radio sounds across all the UK, the British Empire territory. So they started having radio sounds. And that's the 3D, that's like our drilling. That weather stations like our taking surface samples. And the radio sounds are going deep, have a vertical profile, just like our drilling core holes into the subsurface. We have started to have a three-dimensional picture. And then came airplanes. There we have weather reconnaissance airplanes. But it started right after the World War II. You have all these planes and pilots don't know what to do after they come back from Europe. And Joanne Simpson is one of the pioneers in weather research. Just called them up. Hey guys, can you fly us in and out of the clouds? They said, sure, we have nothing to do. So that's how they started to connect the dots in out of the clouds, chasing hurricanes, doing all kinds of crazy things. The pilots loved it. And so Joanne Simpson is an incredible person. This book described her. And she was the only female meteorologist at that time, and it's right after the war. And she was a PhD student of Rossby. We heard of Rossby waves in the atmosphere in the ocean. And Rossby did big tank experiments, rotating the tank to see how current gets deformed into rotations. And she said, she went to Rossby, she said, I'm going to study cumulus clouds. And then Rossby said, oh, that's a nice subject for a little girl. And because nobody else is interested in it, if you work very hard, you might learn something new. We have come a long way. But anyway, so we have airplanes starting to connect the dots, making into a three-dimensional. Nowadays, we have this global observing system, but it really started with the dots on a 2D map. They're connected over a century, through time, through technology, but really the desire to see the atmosphere as a whole. It's the desire that drove it. We can, today we have 3D, high resolution, dynamic observation system, and the world invests so much in maintaining this system. And we have weather, but you see the core, you still have weather stations, radio sounds, and then your computer models, you have radar, you have satellite, you have airplane, and all that. But this didn't happen quickly, it happened over a century. So we can take a century to get that point. Maybe we'll take shorter. Okay, so admittedly, the ocean is, the atmosphere is more transparent. It's a lot easier to observe, and it moves fast. It's more global. It's low viscosity fluid. So it is indeed very, very global. So they have more incentive, and we are so fixed. We don't mix, we don't move. That structure, that heterogeneity, that troubling, heterogeneity will still be there. And the atmosphere is mixed. The changes will be gone next moment. But the atmosphere is also bigger and more turbulent and deeper. And from cloud physics to the entire planet, they have a whole scale sort of challenge, just as we do. Okay, so let's look at the ocean scientists. They did the same thing. Started with the Humble. Those floats, they're anchored floats. You've seen all these kind of things. They'll have weather stations on it. And now they have a global ocean observation systems with a whole suite of tools. And the most important, the anchoring suite of observations is the Argo float system. And they have instruments that can control the buoyancy, so it can go up and down. They put them in 1 kilometer depth. They call that docking depth. So those floats are increasing over the years, 20 years or so. Now it's densely, strategically placed. So it stay at 1 kilometer. Every 10 days they float up and then sink down, measuring the whole profile. They're not anchored, so they drift. And then the drift gives us a sense of the current. So they have very clever ways to model the three-dimensional properties of the ocean and the motion of the ocean. And this is a very important result through the Argo fleet, because it tells you this is the years from 2005 when Argo started to form a network to 2023. And here's the depth of the ocean. Argo goes to 2 kilometer depth going down, and the deep Argo goes to 6 kilometers down. That measuring the deepest ocean now. So they have the ambition to measure the ocean, no matter what it costs. They go ask for money for funding agencies to do this. And so we have this picture. We know the ocean, deep ocean is warming. This is really frightening. But without this Argo fleet, they would not know. How is our continental crust changing? Do we have a picture like this? Can we tell the world? Right, we don't. But they have to, we need this kind of, sort of ambitious kind of shameless request to the funding agencies to support something on this scale. Okay, so again, started with the dots, and then over the time, the dots are connected. Now there's a global ocean observation system called the GOOSE that comprises all these floats, anchored or unanchored, and submarine, those gliders. Rutgers developed those gliders. So Rutgers launched those gliders and crossed the ocean to take measurements and program them to go up and down and transect. So they can have this profiling, this tremendous dense 3D profiling program. Yeah?
Oh, what's F? Is that an animal?
Where? Oh, yes, dolphin. They tag dolphins, and they tag whales. They tag a lot of marine mammals because they traverse the ocean. So they actually provide data. They are, our mobile instruments. And also biologists really understand. My husband studied mercury in marine accumulation, and this data is really important for him to figure out where the tuna has been eating what kind of fishes, and how the mercury and other trace metals accumulate up the food chain. Okay, so these are, again, the ocean, it's through the desire to connect the dots, and we have now today a fabulous observation system. And again, admitted that ocean is more global, it's more communicating laterally than hydrogeology, but it's bigger, deeper. They have a turbulent enclosure problem, just as which we don't have. Okay, so then perhaps we can, audaciously propose that we can put all the dots, those one-dimensional vertical columns, drill holes. We have millions of drill holes, borehole data. It's all wasted. It's all in paper format, hidden. The Department of Energy in the U.S. have millions of drill holes in paper. Nobody uses it. Put in boxes, filed away, wasted. But think of the investment that we have taxpayer have made. Think of if we could put all this data together to build this, three-dimensional digital crust. We can reuse. We can, add value to what people have done 100 years ago. We've been mapping the geology for 200 years, for God's sake. All that data, if we could put it together. Okay, so idea is we can put all the dots on the global map and then connect the dots and then find patterns. Are there across the theme, cross-board patterns that we can say that's true, that's almost true to large areas? And then we can explain the processes behind these patterns, and we can extrapolate to places that we don't have. We can identify gaps and maybe generate more dots to, like the ocean scientists, to fill this void. Okay, so that is the sort of proposal we can as a community can attack. Okay, so going back to this slide, we have these questions. So too many questions, right? So I'm going to be lazy and pick some of the simplest ones in the hydrology part to as a proof of concept. Can we actually do this? So I'm going to just answer this as atmospheric boundary condition. Can we help the Earth system modelers define the necessary depth that they must include in order to get land to atmosphere fluxes correct? Okay, so I'm going to ask how deep is the water table. That's widely observed. I'm lazy. I'm starting with the simplest ones. This is not the results are irrelevant, but really the concept, to prove the concept, this is completely achievable. That's the idea. So I'm going to ask how deep is the water table, and how deep are plant roots, and then how deep is the infiltration. And after asking these questions with the dots, I'm going to show the dots on the map, and then connect the dots and find patterns. And then we can use a model. Using some simple statistics, we can discover some patterns, but using a global model. Modeling is a wonderful synthesis tool to test hypotheses and to put all the observation, to put our ideas together, and to generate, three-dimensional continuous estimates of some surfaces. Okay, so that is what I'm going to do next. So I should stop at the. I should stop already, right?
You have 40 minutes including.
Okay, good. I'm going to run fast. I have too much to say. Okay, so first question, how deep is the water table? And this is really motivated by first time when I see this diagram, I said, this doesn't make sense. Where's the water table? I need to figure out the water table. And we have this idea, rain falling on the land goes into infiltration, and then some gets pumped up. There's some quick flow, but going into the groundwater. And this groundwater flow is so thin, you can have multiple scales. And then you can have losing streams, you can have gaining streams. There's two-way interaction, which Audrey showed, but at grand scale, at the catchment and the continental scale, from continental divide to the ocean. You have all these two-way interactions. And we know this is how we visualize the flow. And but this doesn't make sense. So first order question, how deep is the water table? If the water table is very shallow, then the plants will use it, and if it's very deep, and then it's freely drained. So where on Earth, the water table is deep and shallow. So I spent many years, this was starting in 2007, data at that times were not put on the internet as much. Nowadays it's much easier. But I spent many years doing this. I can't get funding. Nobody's funding me to do this kind of thing. What are you talking about? Putting together a global data set. I cannot convince funding agency. So I did this myself. I cannot give to grad students. Didn't have grad students. Took me 7 years to put this together. Calling people, emailing people, threatening, bribing, whatever I could do, I put this data together. So there's a lot of hosts, but there's some points now on the data. There's some dots. Okay, so the dots, let's look at the dots in the best observed continent. You can see some patterns already. Climate plays a role, and the eastern part is shallower, and the western part is deeper in general, so climate, and the coast sea level. All the coastline wells have shallow water table. It makes sense because the ocean is our boundary condition. You can't drain below. So it's the climate models have free draining columns on the coastal. So they have deserts basically because there's no water. They just drain so freely. And so, but climate is not the whole picture. At a smaller scale, the regional scale, at the landscape scale, river valleys stand out. And I did my dissertation in the Great Basin. So you have shallow water table in the valleys and deep in the mountains, and that's all make intuitive sense. Well, this chart is important. So we can have shallow water table in arid regions. We can have deep water table in humid regions just because of drainage. Water flows downhill, simple as that. Okay, so that's something already useful. We can tell the climate modelers that land is not always freely drained, and the terrain-driven flows converging to the valleys create this mosaic that is not explained by the climate. Under the same climate, you can have deep and shallow. So climate alone is not sufficient. So we have to consider topography. And water table can be, a water source for plants if it's shallow, right? And because this says, less than 2.5 meters, and I know trees can go that deep. I know there's wetlands. This is all prairie potholes, and in this area, it's all wetlands. So water table plays a role. And so we already tell the ESM modelers that, wait a minute, land drainage actually determines the water availability, and it will really affect the vegetation. But is it really a source for vegetation? How deep, how shallow is shallow enough? But that depends on how deep the roots are, right? So it's the same question, the other side, the same question. So that led me to look at how deep roots are. And okay, so that's the second question, the orange one, how deep roots are. And so, let's see, though this redundant, right. Is 1 meter roots describe all herbaceous plants? Is 2 meter roots describe all woody plants? That's the question. Okay, so I don't have to start from scratch. First, I look at this paper that's published. On the vertical is the rooting depth, 20 meters. And on the horizontal is the organized, this is individual plants that are organized by biomes. And it all make good sense. Tundra is shallow, crops are shallow. But what really stood out at that time is this large variability in arid, seasonally arid savannas, tropical savannas, semi-arid shrubland, and a desert. So you have shallow, you have deep. You can't really say that desert will have deeper roots. Not true. That cactus has a very, very wide, shallow roots because the rain doesn't wet enough, deep enough. The plants, why would the roots go to bone dry, hard soil, right? So it's shallow. So this is not true. So it's the range, variability, that is really intriguing. Well, there are many reasons, different species, different age of plants. But I think a very, very obvious reason is hydrology. Is how deep the water table is, how deep the vadose zone is, how much water it supports. So these wrinkles and nooks and crannies on land, because of the simple land hydrology, mostly subsurface hydrology, must matter. So I started my own compilation. But before I walk that, let's just think through this. Why land hydrology matter? Okay, so in the dry season, this is a dry season image, infiltration right now. Infiltration is pretty shallow. And there's the water table. Water comes from the top. And capillary rise also provide water below. Here you have a dry zone, dry gap, that the infiltration doesn't meet the capillary rise. Here they overlap, and here it's almost saturated land surface. So if you are a plant sitting on the top of the hill, what would you do? Infiltration is shallow, you can't go deeper than that, right? So this is kind of infiltration limited rooting depth. And this is a shrub in Negev desert in Israel. A woody shrub has 2 meter wide roots and 10 centimeter, this much, but 2 meter wide. Why? Because the rain is so rare and so shallow penetrating. And so you try to gather as much rain as you can. And when the rain does fall. So that's the wetting zone. So that's why they're shallow and they're widespread. Cactus does the same thing. And then if you're further downhill, somewhere further down, and these two wetting fronts are closer to each other, you can actually sense it. So you can have like this so-called dimorphic roots, one cluster on the top that uses the wet season rain, and then there's another cluster below that uses the groundwater in the dry season. And so there are lots of examples. I'm going to show you some eucalyptus. And here it's in Western Australia, just south of Perth. And you have this dense cluster that uses the rain when the wet season comes. And then you have another cluster right above the water table at 15 meters. And in the middle, just pipes, just transporting pipes. So this is the dimorphic roots. And here's a quarry exposure of a eucalyptus tree that is very, you can see the clusters here right above the water table, branches out again. Okay, so further down, and you're in a happy spot. Your soil is wet, so water is not a limiting factor. And in these cases, nutrients often dominate the root profile. Mostly shallow because the nutrient recycling from standing biomass come from the top. Water is not limiting, so they go chase after nutrients. And further down, you're going to have seasonal water logging, and this will push the roots shallower because they don't like to go down there. There's no oxygen. You can't respire. So you see examples like this. This is in the Amazon, in the Colombian Amazon, and you have 50-meter tall trees, but very shallow roots. And to have stability, they have those stilts and buttresses to keep them stable. And so they're very. This is the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 60 centimeters. So it's less than 1 meter. This is only 30 centimeter roots, and because they have buttresses, they can be supported on the top. And this is a picture of a place, in the valley in Oregon, and so it's actually quite waterlogged. So you've probably all seen trees toppled with a shallow root plate. That's because, number one, you don't need to go deep. And in the valley, because the water table capillary force is enough to support them. They don't want to, roots, plants are smart. They don't really want to invest in anything that's not necessary. Roots are very expensive to maintain. Globally, they're about 20% of the biomass, but they use 40% of the hydrocarbon produced. So because they are being chewed up by a lot of stuff down there, they can live on the roots. So it's very expensive. And further down, you get into sort of a permanently waterlogged places, and then it's entirely different plants. Those spartan, and they have mechanism pumping oxygen through their parenchyma go into the root, so they can live. So this is the green hydrology should and must explain some of the patterns. So you can see that under any climate, you can have shallow roots, deep roots, and shallow again. So that range is stretched out, particularly in arid, season-arid, semi-arid climate, because you have actually water limitation. And slight changes in water availability makes a big difference. So plants respond to that slight change. And hill slope change is systematic, and it's quite dramatic change. And the plants can express that. You will see walking if we take a hike, you'll see plants are very different in the valleys and in the hills because of hydrology. Okay, so I can't test this hypothesis. Hydrology is important. So I started my own data collection because the earlier collections never recorded. They only record the climate and the soil texture. That's all. They didn't record the position, the elevation, the drainage conditions. So I started collecting data. It took me another 7 years to pull this together. And I also recorded the soil B horizons, soil hard pans, and bedrock surface. Where's the bedrock depth? And so the environment was much more articulated. So I put together 2,000 individuals and over 1,000 species, and I want to see here the dots, right? Here the dots, and let's try to connect the dots. And climate, right? Is climate a driver? Not quite. You can see under this is precipitation, annual precipitation on the horizontal, and the rooting depth in the vertical up to 100-meter depth. And so it's log scale, downward is deeper. And so at any rainfall, there is like order of magnitude changes. So climate doesn't really give you a very clear signal. So let's look at the substrate. And here's the soil texture from fine to coarse. Doesn't really give you much clean signal. It's on the log scale. So this is several orders of magnitude at any given soil texture. And then I plotted the soil hard pan, soil B horizons often, and then bedrock surface and in circles. And you see many plants get stopped, but many, just as many, went through the barriers and follow the rock fractures. So the barrier and the conduit structure is very important. Roots actually notice that. I can expand this to see what are the roots that actually penetrate deep into the rocks, and they're all in arid, semi-arid seasonal climate. Thailand has a strong monsoon season, wet and dry, and California, Portugal, and so they are, California. The reason is that you need a very, very strong wet season to wet the entire profile deeply, and then dry season comes, and then plants have no choice but to go deeper. So you need that stress in the dry season and then replenishment in the wet season that can lead to deep infiltration and a deep roots. And so this is the combination. The arid climate, only woody plants. The herbaceous plants didn't do much. Herbaceous plants basically stayed above. And it's the woody plants that have the capacity to invest, to build on last year's root, they can go deep. Okay, so that's the substrate. Again, shows the substrate importance. And then you have to look at the plant functional types. Are there any patterns? I rank them so you see some order. Small succulent can store a lot of water, and so they can have shallow roots, and that's basically the cactus family. And then large, deepest roots in the broadleaf evergreen trees like oaks, like eucalyptus. And so those are all in seasonal climate, poplars. And so they tap groundwater, so they go really deep. And so lastly, the groundwater. Here's the groundwater. The best correlation is really with water table. So water table is really a good boundary to determine rooting depth where there is water table is accessible. There are some places water table is not accessible. They don't know, don't care. And the ones that have consensus will go to the water table. So we'll call that groundwater push and pull. And in the shallow part, it pushes roots shallower. In the part that is accessible but deeper, it pulls roots deeper. So this groundwater push and pull made the curve, made the points tighter. And nowhere else are examples of this, little book that I by accident discovered. And I asked for library loan from University of Nebraska. They sent me sheets of paper stapled, and that's the book. So what happened is during the Great Depression, the government was creating jobs, so there's all these unemployed people. They said, okay, let's look at the trees, finding things to do. Let's look at the trees. Some of the belt they planted tree belt for the wind breaks. Some trees lived, some trees died. Let's see, maybe the roots can tell us. So they had 40 men out there digging roots, and they spent a lot of time and sketching out the roots and digging the roots. It's all in eastern Nebraska, so the climate doesn't change much. The soil is all loess. So it's a perfect experiment to see how important groundwater is. Here's plains, cottonwood, and you have water table is at 2.5 feet. And the roots stop there. This is the groundwater push. And then here, the water table is 14 feet. This is the groundwater pull. So the push and the pull really bears out here. They're just pages and pages of these beautiful drawings. And they say 4 men, 10 days to complete each tree to excavate. So it's a lot of work, but that's the point, right? To create work. And so here's another, the Siberian elm, same species, but same soil, same climate, the water table depth really made the difference. And if you plot all those data points here, you see a cluster. This is in linear plot now, the rooting depth to 6 meter, the water table depth to 25 meter. And so here, the roots are far above the water table. Don't know, don't care. These are things over here. And in some range in the middle, you can see the segregation of 3 clusters. In some range, they can sense the capillary rise, so they are being pulled deeper. And here is the roots ending the water table. They're probably pulled and pushed a little bit. So you see these 3 clusters that really demonstrate this groundwater push and pull. So we can have a new conceptual model that the climate is important, but the climate seasonality, not just dry or wet, but the seasonality stands out. This is the wet season and dry season alternating create this gradient. And on the horizontal is the terrain, very low, flat, poorly drained, and excessively drained. And then so in the intersections of climate and terrain, we can predict the routes. If you're desert, high ground, you're limited by infiltration. There's a dry gap, actually. I just compiled data to demonstrate the dry gap where it exists. And then if you are in the floodplain or the terraces of the rivers, you can sense groundwater, you go deep. And here you have the salinity, not just only waterlogging, but salinity. And then in the seasonal climate, you're limited to your seasonal infiltration depth. But in very, very wet climate, the rain comes down constantly, there's no point in going deeper. So they are actually shallow again. So you have shallow, deep, shallow, and shallow, deep, shallow. So this pattern is not a linear trend. You cannot just explain it by climate alone or by terrain alone. Okay, so this is why in the arid, semi-arid climate, you have this range because shallow, deep, and shallow. Hydrology made that stretch. All right, so again, we can send some messages to the ESM modeling community. The water table is an important driver for plant rooting depth. The influence above ground plant hydraulic trace. I don't have time to present that. We measured the embolism vulnerability, the P50, if you have heard of that, and the tissue density, wood tissue density, xylem conduits of Amazon trees in the savanna site and in the seasonal forest site. Water table access explained that variation. In the valleys, plants have plenty of water, so they have wide conduits. And so they are also very vulnerable when drought comes, and they just die because they cavitated, the cells are too large, they just die. So it explains above ground traits, and there's a lot of work coming out now, and I can point to you. And Earth system models can really benefit by including groundwater. Not only they get river flow right, they will also get the plants right. So that's the message we can send to the plant and the modeling community. But then I'm just waving my hand. I didn't show how infiltration affects rooting depth. Is this true? At that time, this paper was published in 2017. I didn't have a lot of infiltration data. So I said, is this true? Are they limited to infiltration? So that led to the third question, how deep is the infiltration? So that's my orange. I'm going backwards. Water table led to rooting depth now led to infiltration because I was just arm waving at that time. And the paper was accepted in PNAS without revision. So that was the easiest submission ever. But I couldn't get funding for it. I got turned down by 4 NSF programs, by 1 DOE program. But when it comes to publication, there was no barrier at all. I never had that. And it's the only time I never had that before, never had that after. Okay, so that's how deep is the infiltration. Again, we put the dots on the map. But again, with the plant, you can see the power of zooming in into individuals. If you just come down, top down, you will never have this kind of insights. That's why I'm saying site studies, for plants, individual-based studies are the foundation to zoom out. And so we need that insight. So don't stop what you're doing. And that's basic discovery, but then we also need to think about how to zoom out. So here's the infiltration depth. And this is the last few years of work. I haven't finished it, but again, I'm going to show as a concept. Because each paper, I have to do the calculation. They have soil moisture profiles, I have to figure out how deep, seasonally, the deepest infiltration depth. And so the seasonal deep infiltration depth will be limited by plants. Plants play a big role because they pump water back up before they can go down. And the water table plays a big role because infiltration cannot go deeper. Okay, but the climate also plays a big role. So let's detect the patterns in here. The first hypothesis, the climate matters. So I plotted infiltration depth versus annual precipitation. It's a cloud, but ecologists think this is wonderful. They are very tolerant with poor correlation, but they think this is fine. But what if you just accept that, we can say, oh, the blue line is seasonally wet and dry, but also winter wet. Winter wet has the deepest infiltration. Why? If the wet season is in winter, exactly. It's the vegetation more dormant, evaporation is lower, so winter wet climates really respond to the precipitation increase. It's already deeper, but every 100 millimeter they go even deeper. So they're only responsive. I mean, the others kind of responsive, but it's kind of muted. So that is the hypothesis. And at the landscape scales, of course, here we show water table has to be the terminating point for infiltration. And sure enough, you have water table. This is colors, different climate. And even in very dry climate, this is in Negev desert again, they reach the water table that is 10 meter deep and 12 meter deep. Why? Fractures. This is limestone fractures. So you have preferential flow. Preferential flow is so important when you look at the infiltration depth. Okay, so at the plot scale substrate here, I'm showing soil texture. It didn't really play out so well. Why? Because that's the surface texture. It's the vertical profile, barriers, conduits that matter most. So here is the barrier. One barrier is the soil B horizons, the BT, BK horizon, the calcium or clay or aluminum horizons. They are actually a very strong control on infiltration depth. That's no surprise because the B horizons formed at the infiltration depth. That's where the infiltration stopped and deposited all the stuff leached from above, and then they cemented. And then there's a feedback. So a developing B horizon will stop rain and then depositing more minerals and precipitating more minerals, and then it will stop the next rain. So through this positive feedback, they develop this horizon. And so that prevents the deep flushing. And so B horizon is very important. But through and there's also this a three-way interaction, because if the rain stops here, plants love it because then water is being held there. So plant roots also end in the B horizon. Most of them, some will go through. And so it's the vegetation. And then when the plants use water, that make the rain infiltration even weaker, so it stops there again, so it never goes below. So there's a three-way interaction through time that forms these B horizons that is a powerful barrier for infiltration and for roots. And pores, the macropores and fractures. So some of the studies reported macropores, some didn't. But you can see this is mean annual precipitation. This is the infiltration depth. The blue is the reported evidence for macropores and fractures. So they are, on the global average, 5 meter deeper. 5 meter, everything else 5 meter deeper. Same climate with fractures, without fractures, it's a big difference. Okay, lastly, the biomass. Plants matter because they use water, but their function is hump-shaped, and this is biomass. As biomass in a very arid region, they don't have much impact, and as the climate got wetter, they start to grow bigger, but they're growing bigger, thirstier, faster than the rain increase, so you have less rain going through it. And then when you get the entirely wet season, wet places, large biomass, actually you don't have any water shortages, so you has no effect on infiltration. The impact on infiltration is low again. So there's a lot of details I cannot explain. Plants are actually islands of deep infiltration, right? We all know that because there's biogenic macropores. But the plants do that for their own sake. They pump them back up. So you have more infiltration through the funneling, everything going into the root zone, but later on they use it. They're not going to spare it for you, for somebody else, for deep recharge. They actually did that because that benefited them as well. So there's a lot of deep feedbacks and interesting plant adaptation we don't have time to talk about, but the point is that we can connect the dots and see some large patterns. So porous media structure is critical. We can tell the ES and land modeling community, you have to somehow include the barriers and conduits. And what's another thing? Preferential flow is really the norm. It's of course, nature is never homogeneous. Of course, there's preferential flow. You don't need proving, but the concept tells us that. But data also shows that. Okay, so earlier I said I was arm waving infiltration depth controls rooting depth, and here I plotted all the rooting depth and the infiltration depth data that are observed simultaneously, the same place, and you'll see the curve pretty well lined up. These ones that deviators, I'm writing a paper to explain, they all are explained by either preferential flow or vegetation changed by humans. From grasslands to trees. Trees require more water, so they went deeper. Went deeper, they're using old water. And if you cut down trees and crossing grasslands, and then they use less water, and so their roots are shallower, so they don't follow. But all in all, infiltration from the top and the groundwater from below, these two can really adequately explain and the plant rooting depth behavior. Okay, so where are we? So again, the message is that ESM, you need to account for subsurface structure, barriers and conduits, and B horizons particularly. We have global B horizon data. We can actually use that, but we don't have deep fracture data, and that's where we can really help. Okay, so this goes to my last question. What is the depth that supplies ET? And so we have some insights on the 3 hydrologic depths. Now we can look at the boundary layer. I call that the lithosphere boundary layer for the climate. What is that depth? Okay, so this I have to use a model because we need to provide a continuous picture for the modeling community. So I can explain why model the dots are so sparse, right? I'll show you. Our dots are limited and also biased. If you look at rooting depth, it's all in well-funded countries. The rest of the world is very poorly covered. And also it's mostly limited to dry places. That's the place we're curious about roots, how deep roots are. And so it's very biased and very limited. So here's the distribution of the observations, rooting depth observation. Peaks in 1 meter and 2 meter. Really? That supports the climate scientist's approach, 1 meter, 2 meter. No, because the pits, the digging pits stopped at 1 meter or 2 meter. So anything deeper than that, they didn't record. So the data is very biased, and how coarse in sections in 1 meter, 2 meter. So it's very biased. For example, especially deep roots, and they're biased for herbaceous plants as well. Deep roots are so hard to excavate, and when you do that, you kill the tree. So it's very, very rarely done. And so here is a deep root, 52 meter deep in Arizona, a mesquite tree, and then it's the open, quarry to get gravel. And then they see these white wires sticking out of the wall. They said, oh my God, it's undetonated bombs. They called the bomb squad. The bomb squad looked at it. They said, you idiots, those are roots, called biologists. And so they did the DNA. They related to the mesquite tree's bulb. So we discovered that by accident. And the deepest roots are in my data set, 70 meter, the shepherd's tree, the acacia trees in Botswana, in the sandy soils. And they're drilling groundwater wells, and they pull out live, plump roots. And so all the deep roots are discovered by accident. We're not looking for them. So God knows how deep they are. What's the deepest? We know the highest tree is 120 meters, but we don't know what the deepest roots are. So we discovered them by accident. So it tells us that the dots are very valuable, but they have limitations. So here are, and we're never going to have enough dots anyway, right? The world is just too diverse. And so here model can come in as a helpful tool. I'm going to have to quickly go through this. It's a very simple model. We call that ASAP, as simple as possible. So ASAP model, called ASAP model. And so basically you have a column. The land is in column about 1 kilometer wide and 1 kilometer deep, but the permeability decreases exponentially. But the decrease depends on the slope. If it's very, very flat slope, it decreases slowly. If it's a steep slope, it decreases quickly. Basically, the geological sort of empirical data to show, because valleys accumulate sediments, they shed sediments, that's all. And so we also have two-way groundwater exchange. This depends on whichever has higher water level. We also have floodplains. We have to solve the flow momentum equation in floodplains because it's the pressure-driven flow, not elevation-driven flow. So there's a lot of numerical details. I'm not going to talk about it, but it's just basically a hydrology model. Richard's equation for the soil, Darcy's law for the horizontal. It's a 2D. It's a Dupuy-Forchheimer approximation. So that's the bone and can talk to you about it in the details. With that soil infiltration coming down, water table rise and fall, we create the environment for roots. So we invented a root function called the ease function. That is, if the soil is very wet compared to the leaf water potential, which is negative 1.5 megapascal, and then that drives that's the driver and driving force. And also wetter soils are more conductive, and below is the height. So it's penalized by height, by depth. Deeper soils have higher lifting, uses more energy. And so this is the lifting height, and this is the potential driving the flow. So this is just a way to propagate, to allocate which layer the soil can take water. So the soil layer take horizontal layers, parallel connections. So once we have the ease function, we can use Ohm's law. Basically, the wetter, shallower soil take more water. The principle is as shallow as possible, as deep as necessary, just like you and I. As little work as possible, as much work as necessary. They behave just like humans, and I believe I'm related to them. And so with this model, my colleague, a physicist in University of San Diego de Compostela in Spain, did all the coding work. He is just amazing. Okay, so here is sort of an example, give you a taste of the model. We have dynamic infiltration depth, those green arrows coming in, shallow, deep. We solve this equation hourly. Time step. Here's the water table rising and falling. Here you go. And here's the root uptake proportions in different depths. So the idea is that, don't worry about the infiltration, all the patterns. The idea is that with some dots, we can get insights. With the insights, we can put that into global models. With the global models, we can fill the gaps to get some idea. Models have lots of problems. It's not the number that matters, but it's really the pattern. So it's possible for us to get the global patterns. Here's the mean water table depth from that model. Here's the root uptake depth of 95% depth from that model. And if you look at the details, here is the Nebraska area, that little book. It's very, very close to what we model predict. And then so the model also increased the deeper root distribution, especially in the southern hemisphere when you have the strong dry season, wet, dry season. Okay, so I'm running out of time. This is model infiltration depth, and this is the ET supply depth. Eventually, ET supply depth is just the rooting depth plus the capillary supply support zone. And that's it. So we add this together, and this is the depth. This is not driven by climate. It's not driven by terrain alone. It's a very complex interactions. In the Sahara, it's very shallow because the rain doesn't. It's infiltration limited. And down here in the Amazon, it's water table limited. It's very shallow, so you don't need to go deep. And so, but further south, it's infiltration limited again because your dry season, water table is deep. And so it switches different places, different times, has different processes. And so this rich picture cannot be really just assign a model 1 meter, 2 meter. It varies depending on processes. And so here's the graph, much deeper than 2 to 3 meters for sure. And it's highly varied. And this variability cannot be infiltration, roots, and water table, and the continental scale water redistribution. Okay, so that's my message. So it's really just a proof of concept that perhaps it's possible. If I can do it myself, the community can definitely do much better. Okay, so then how deep does the lithosphere plumbing go? I'm just starting, but this is an intriguing data set that using isotopes, the deepest groundwater, modern day groundwater, is in mountains, under mountains. We always thought mountains have lower permeability, so they shouldn't go deep, but they go deep. What is it? Fractures and high elevation. The fractures, bulk permeability doesn't make any sense. It's the fractures that induces very deep infiltration. And so fractures are related to stress. And here is the world stress map. This group, world stress people, every few years update this, putting together all data, all sorts of data. Synthesis, it's the synthesis. They put together stress map. Mountains have high stress. On the borders, yeah, you have tectonic boundary, we call the plate boundary effect. But inside, all mountains have high stress. And we know that because we have I'm going to show you the CGO. Some CGO shows that the mountains actually are more permeable. So there's a lot of study doing that. I'm just putting together. So here we go. And I'm summarizing up. This is our really the most important bottleneck task we need to do, putting together a global permeability, porosity structure. The question here, is that even possible? I think so. We started this digital crust project about 10 years ago. We got some funding, and we dreamed of defining the brittle ductile transition, the fractures where things just move like fluid, that transition, basement rock, sedimentary rock transition, and then stratigraphy, working with the whole earth science community. We didn't get very far because of my poor leadership, but Shannon Peters, one of the team, did wonderful things. He created this thing called MacroStrat. He put together hundreds of map sources, millions of geologic observations, cores, and sedimentary sections, you name it. He used a GeoDeep Dive, which is basically a machine learning tool to integrate all the geologic data. So there are polygons. When you have field data, you have large polygons, but the polygons size is decreasing, density increasing. Each polygon you click, you can get the whole sequence. But he's interested, he's a paleontologist, he's interested in age of the rocks and the fossil records in the rocks. So he can reconstruct mass extinction events. He's a wonderful young geologist in the University of Wisconsin. So it's possible. We also now have so many geophysical surveys at the site size. Just imagine we can put all that together on top of MacroStrat, and then you can have larger picture, MacroStrat pictures, and then you zoom in to see all the local structures. And so I wanted to mention this, that it's time for us to do some synthesis. And E.D. Wilson, this is very, very highly quoted. We are drowning in information while starving for wisdom. The world henceforth will be run by synthesizers, people able to put together the right information at the right time, think critically about it, and make important choices. So this hydrogeology is ripe for synthesis because it's so complex at multiple scales. It's all over the place. Can we extract some simplicity to tell the world? Okay, I have to stop. We need to do a few things. But the bottom line is that when you create a dot and think about, put it on the global map and think about where else this dot might be valid. So the summary, we are in the age of rapid global change. ESMs are our only crystal balls. The lithosphere is the most opaque, it's most complex, opaque, literally and figuratively. We have detailed knowledge at the core scales, but we can connect the dots and discover patterns. And this is a responsibility. I think Sam said it's a duty of our community to really engage in global change. We need a synthesis-minded leaders, especially from the young people, aka you. Okay, that's it. Sorry for running over time.
All right, let's just take a couple questions and then we'll have more time to talk with Ying if you would like the coffee and lunch. Sam, has a question.
Yeah. I have a question about the role of the river network.
The river network?
When you look at the system, most of the rain, of the water, is going from hill slope to the next river. This is a large amount of flux in the system. And so the hill slope distance, for instance, the length of the hill slope fits the amplitude of the water table. It's general. But when the river network has its own dynamics.
Yes.
So if the rainfall is smaller,
yes,
then the density decreases.
Yes.
And the
Yes.
inverse of the density, which
Yes.
is the length between two rivers, increases.
I totally agree. Yes.
So you can have deep circulation
Yes.
only by decreasing the network density. So why
Yes.
not using the river network as the main boundary condition of large-scale like that?
Yes, it's used in our ASOP model. There's a dynamic conductance between groundwater and river. Depends on water table heights. The water table is very low, then the river shrinks, and it's built in the model. I don't have time to talk about all the details, but I totally agree with you.
That was a great talk. Thank you. I was just curious if you could talk a little bit more about some of the time. You talk about like a changing world and like kind of the effect of landscape changes. Some of these infiltration patterns, vegetation patterns.
Yeah, time. What do you mean by?
Change over time.
Yes.
You mentioned reforestation as well.
Yes, yes. We have a 15-year simulation, and it's driven by LAI. So we don't explicitly model the change, but LAI, leaf area index, biomass, is really the single most important variable that determines water needs, water demand. So that is in the model, but we haven't analyzed that. And there's, yes, the deforestation happening, and the other way around as well. Reforestation in the last plateau in China is changing a lot of the hydrology. Yes, the reverse, all directions. Yeah, we haven't analyzed that though. I'm just showing that as a proof of concept. The idea is that it's possible. We can do this. Yeah.
Okay, last question.
I really liked the root diagram with infiltration depth and capillary rise. It was very simple, easy to follow. I imagine though from a plant perspective, it being nice from like a competition perspective, if some get very good at shallow water collection and some get very good at deep water collection.
Yes.
Is it really as fine cut as it is in the diagram?
Of course not. Of course not. Yeah. It's limited by data collection first, and our data coverage, and computation is a big deal. The Walker's hypothesis, the two-layer hypothesis, herbaceous plants use shallow water, and woody plants use deep water. And that's just found in many places actually makes total sense. So this is, the individual level, I did not record the interaction with the neighbors because they don't record. They don't give you the data. They don't measure several plants, the same community, what's the rooting, because it's very hard to separate what roots belong to what plant. It's extremely hard. Above ground, you can see the leaf morphology, bark morphology. You can separate. Below ground, they all look the same. You have to do DNA analysis. It tells you that they all have the similar functions. So the morphology is very similar. Yeah, but that's a very good point.
All right, let's thank you one more time.